At a global level, the mood is very pessimistic. A lot of economic integration is being disrupted, but at a regional level, ironically enough, I actually find it more hopeful. The US should treat Central Asians as the subjects of their own stories. I think we're in a much better place than we were 10 years ago.
Hello and welcome back to the Astana Times channel. Today I'm joined by Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President for Studies at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Evan, thank you for joining us today. So I would like to start by asking you some of your impressions from the Astana Club event. I know that it's not your first time taking part in the discussion platform.
Yeah, it's not. I think what I'm struck by is that at a global level, the mood is very pessimistic. And that's partly because of Russia's war in Ukraine, but also things like the strategic competition between the US and China, which is having a lot of debilitating economic effects. But at a regional level, ironically enough, I actually find it more hopeful. If you compare where Central Asia is now to where it was in, say, 2014-15, much less 2007-8, there's actually greater economic interaction among the countries. And I think for a country like Kazakhstan, people are seeing opportunities to leverage some of the contradictions at the global level actually for advantage. One example is multinational companies that are re-domiciling from Russia under sanctions to here in Kazakhstan. But it's also true that Kazakhstan and other countries in the region are able to demand more from external economic partners than before. So, on the surface, it's very pessimistic. And when the topics of the US, Russia, China, Europe come up, it's very depressing. But I think at the regional level, actually, it's ironically more hopeful. So you have to scratch a little harder. But it actually gives me some hope for the future of the region.
And that's very good to hear. So we had a chance to talk earlier this morning, and you mentioned that we are witnessing the transition in a world that we expected to be about economic opportunities, but now it's more characterized by security and fragmentation. What are your thoughts on that? Could you elaborate more? And where is Kazakhstan's and Central Asia's role in that picture?
Well, I think there's a lot about the world where economics and security used to run in parallel lines. Countries that were growing together, building together, trading together, investing together, innovating together, in many cases also had a lot of security differences. China and Japan are one example. China and India is another example. China and the United States are another example. Russia and some countries in Western Europe are yet another example. The problem the world is facing now is that instead of economics and security running in parallel lines, they've increasingly collapsed together. And I think a lot of economic integration is being disrupted by what I would call security fragmentation. That's a very debilitating set of trends. And so the answer to that isn't easy, but I think it's partly to find our way to see how we can maximize economic benefits without over-securitizing some areas. Technology is the best example. Almost all technologies, especially emerging and foundational technologies of the future, are dual use in nature, which means they have military applications even when they have economic applications or commercial applications. But that way of thinking about technology can really limit your opportunities if you think about things like biotechnology or the life sciences. There are miraculous innovations, medicines, therapeutics, drugs, vaccines that become possible, but where co-innovation is being disrupted because there's no trust between countries and there's security competition among them. So I think that defines the challenge that we're facing, which is how not to ignore security, but de-securitize, particularly some areas of technology where there's commercial and public benefit. For Kazakhstan, the opportunity is to try, as I said, to leverage some of the contradictions among external partners, but also, frankly, to demand more from its partners. For example, to demand that more value added is left in the region when countries invest here. And I think that's something that requires greater political savvy, but also sometimes leveraging partnerships with neighbors to increase the leverage and bargaining power that Kazakhstan and others have. But I think for a region like this, escaping from that security trap and focusing more on the positive benefits of economic integration, particularly because you're sitting astride very rapidly growing regions of the world, that's the opportunity that's been defined.
And talking about economic opportunities, can we talk more about the potential that's still untapped between the United States and Central Asia in general? And we have seen the increased engagement from the United States over the years with the visits of high-level state officials to the region and the recent C5+1 meeting in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think American economic involvement in Central Asia is very, very uneven. It's disproportionately focused on Kazakhstan. There was a point where the US was the #1 foreign investor in Kazakhstan. Not sure that's the case anymore, but it was disproportionately in one country. And in this country, it was disproportionately in extractive industries like oil and gas, with a few exceptions like building locomotives, which General Electric was doing. So first, it's not a region-wide phenomenon, it's very much a Kazakhstan phenomenon. Now, as I said, it's increasing, for example, in Uzbekistan because of the political change there since 2016 from Mr. Karimov to Mr. Mirziyoyev. But nonetheless, I think the investment environment in most of the countries is really not what American firms that are looking for a return on investment have to manage corruption risk, to be blunt about it, and also have to develop a yield curve that works for their investors. That's the challenge. Now, you mentioned the C5+1 and American diplomatic engagement. I think it's all good that the United States takes a regional approach, but what many people forget is before former Secretary of State John Kerry inaugurated a C5+1, the United States already had a C5+1. When I was in the Bush administration, the United States had something called a Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, a TIFA, with all 5 countries of Central Asia. And in fact, in a world where the United States mostly has bilateral TIFAs, it was the only regional TIFA that the United States had in the world with multiple countries. And so that was a framework before the C5+1 that allowed the United States to work with all 5 countries. And interestingly, it was focused on, as the title implies, trade and investment, not on diplomacy. And so I think too often diplomats, and I'm a former diplomat, tend to sit around and talk, and their form is driving function because they're looking for things to do. But if we learn from the experience of the TIFA, which at one point the United States actually converted into a ministerial meeting among trade ministers, if the United States wants to increase its economic engagement in the region, it needs to focus its regional engagement on that rather than with foreign ministries. And so, not to take anything away from the C5+1, but I think, learning and relearning some of that history in order to think about how to either leverage American strengths through initiatives on technology, on innovation, on entrepreneurship, leveraging the global capital markets, leveraging English language education. Those are the things, rather than just sitting around and having diplomatic meetings, that could really play to American strength. And I'd like to see more of that. I don't see why the US doesn't create a parallel C5+1 that builds beyond the TIFA to, for example, become a public-private partnership that includes US firms and also the US government with regional firms and regional capital markets and even entrepreneurial players in more of an economically forward-leaning grouping. I think that's the challenge.
But you're hopeful, right? I mean, about where do we stand as a region between the relationship between Central Asia and the US? Because you don't sound very hopeful.
No, I'm hopeful about it, but I think the problem is that a lot of the old ways of doing things become routinized. I did another interview with a colleague of yours from the press, and he mentioned that I had written a report on US policy in Central Asia about 10 years ago. And I said, first, I was amazed he remembered it from 10 years ago. And he asked me if any of the principles still applied. And I said, well, the one that I thought should apply the most is that, number one, the US should treat Central Asians as the subjects of their own stories, rather than as the objects of competition with somebody else. And I don't think the US is really doing a good job of that. Increasingly, the US thinks it's competing with China everywhere in the world. And so it's reducing countries into being proxies in a competition, and that's not really their game. If I were Kazakhstan, to use a mathematical metaphor, the mathematical operations that should matter are addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. And so I think, actually, I see some regression in the American relationship with Central Asia in that area. And the other thing is to leverage uniquely American strengths. And there, as I was saying to you, why aren't there larger and more better capitalized STEM or technology education initiatives, entrepreneurship initiatives? There have been some, but disproportionately they come from the government. It's the U.S. Agency for International Development. USAID, they're very, it's a good bureaucracy, but it's a bureaucracy. They don't know a lot about innovation. So I think the foundation is there. I think people have the right idea. I think we're in a much better place than we were 10 years ago, much less when I was in the government. But I think there's so much more to do, and I don't see it happening with the pace, scope, and intensity that I think it ought to. And to do that really means leveraging the private sector, not just the government. And that's what both sides should be able to do.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.